Welcome to Module 10, the last of our modules in the Mercado Institute of International Trade's Import Training Program, entitled Domestic Transportation. This is a milestone. If you've taken the previous 9, you know how difficult it's been. Hopefully, you also know how comprehensive the program has been. That tradition will continue in Module 10, and we'll wrap things up in a nice, tight fashion. We have 5 objectives in Module 10. The first is to present U.S. domestic transportation as the final link in a global import supply chain. This is an important theme. We've spoken from the very beginning about the need to integrate all facets of an inbound program. We will continue that with domestic transportation. Second, we wish to establish clear operational ties between domestic transportation in the U.S. and the overall import process. It's important to integrate all facets of an inbound program, but at the nexus of international transportation and domestic transportation, it's probably the most important, certainly arguably the most important part to bring together. Third, we want to position domestic transportation as a source of competitive advantage and an integral part of a company's value proposition. Fourth, enhance operational knowledge of port drayage, full truckload, less than truckload, and intermodal transportation. As you can see, we'll be looking at 4 different types of transportation: that drayage piece, FTL, LTL, and intermodal. And of course, finally, we're going to highlight the financial implications of managing a domestic transportation program. Each of these facets of domestic transportation have different pricing models. We will look at each of them. Our agenda, needless to say, is consistent with our objectives. We will start off with the theme of domestic transportation and the integrated supply chain. Second, we'll provide a brief, somewhat historical introduction to the U.S. drayage and trucking industries. Third, and this is where we get into the nitty-gritty of each facet of domestic transportation, drayage operations, including the pricing model, the role of less than truckload at the tail end of an import supply chain and its pricing models, full truckload and its corresponding pricing structure, and intermodal operations, which is actually a big part of an integrated import supply chain, speaking specifically about truck to rail to truck intermodal and how that pricing works. Let's not waste any time, and let's be sure to finish up strong. Our title slide here is Domestic Transportation and the Integrated Inbound Supply Chain. We said this already. We'll say it again. The theme of integrating different aspects of transportation, especially as we go from international into domestic, is really quite important. That is indeed the perspective and the viewpoint we're going to take from this moment moving forward. One fact that should be very clear is that domestic transportation can definitely be considered the final leg in an import supply chain. In fact, not only can it be considered the final leg, it must be considered the final leg. We cannot decouple domestic transportation away from the international component, be it ocean freight, air freight, or even rail coming in from Canada or Mexico. To that theme, as we see in our second bullet, not unlike other facets of an inbound supply chain, domestic transportation must be integrated with upstream activities. Going all the way back to Module 1, which was entitled An Integrated Supply Chain. Other modules on sourcing, on purchasing, we talked a lot about integrating activities, bringing them together, identifying the interdependencies that exist as goods move from being on a purchase order into production, into shipping, through customs clearance. That approach doesn't change. In fact, it should become more intense as we transition from an international environment, goods arriving to a port or an airport, out into a domestic environment. A couple of points to make here in our second to last and last bullet. For purposes of this module, domestic transportation is composed of moving goods from a port or airport of arrival to an inland distribution point. Noted in our last bullet, and it is important to be emphatic about this last module does not touch upon, does not include transportation from a distribution point out to a final customer. Nothing to do with e-commerce, small parcel, etc. This is all about domestic transportation, or what is sometimes referred to as domestic on-forwarding, from a port or airport of arrival out to a distribution point where we poise our product to be ready to be sold. But our inbound supply chain, for our purposes, ends at that moment when goods get out to their point of domestic distribution. Within the aforementioned context, domestic transportation can occur under a number of circumstances. And in the next couple of slides, we're going to point out what those circumstances are so we can come back with real-world examples and context and such that helps to illustrate these different scenarios. First, and perhaps the most basic, are ocean shipments that terminate at the port of discharge and are drayed or trucked to a site in close proximity to a port, typically less than 100 miles. Straight up drayage from the port of Norfolk inland 50 miles. Straight up drayage from the port of Boston out to Springfield, Massachusetts, about 100 miles inland. Things like that. Another scenario, second sub-bullet, are ocean shipments that must be on-forwarded to an inland distribution or retail store. On-forwarded can be domestic truck, can also be, as we saw in our ocean model, inland point intermodal, where goods are moving under the same original ocean bill of lading, most likely by rail, to an inland point. We'll cover those scenarios when we get to the intermodal component of our agenda. Some other situations. Containers that are transloaded at a facility in close proximity to a port and must be sent out to DCs, retail stores, e-commerce, fulfillment centers, etc. This is a big one, and we actually talked a lot about transload in our ocean module, as well as in our import operating model module. We will come back to that theme of transload and tie the whole thing together by providing the domestic component of transportation once goods are stripped at a transload facility and sent out to those DCs, retail stores, etc. around the country. And that could be by truck or by rail. We have some good examples there. And then finally, air freight shipments that terminate at an airport in the U.S. and must be sent on to a DC store or directly to a customer. As you can see in the previous and in this slide, we're really setting up the conversation, the operational conversation, contextually, so we can come back and deal with these scenarios in an operations-specific fashion. Finishing up this slide with a trade tip. We said this already. The above type of transportation scenarios are sometimes referred to as domestic on-forwarding. That is somewhat of a freight forwarding term, but it's definitely used around the country. And domestic on-forwarding applies that once an international shipment arrives to a port or airport to the U.S., it has to be sent out to a domestic destination or on-forwarded to a domestic destination. We'll use that term a lot, so we wanted to formalize its use before we did that too much. All right, we're going to stop here. And when we come back, we'll start getting into things like drayage, truckload, less than truckload, and intermodal. See you shortly.